Good morning, everybody. I think our members are probably quite used to the clunky starts that I make to all of these things while I figure out what's going on. But I am absolutely delighted to be joined once again by Rachael Wardell, who's the Director for Children's Services in Surrey. Rachael, we met first here in August, which on the one hand feels like an age away. And I think from a work perspective, things happen so fast that it almost feels like yesterday, doesn't it?
Yeah, both those things are true. It's very nice to be back again, though.
Thank you. So we had a really interesting discussion last time, and then we had a lot of feedback from parents, and most of the questions really centered on trying to understand bits of the EHCP process, and particularly there were lots of questions and confusion, I think, around tribunal data and how that works. And I've had a number of people in the last couple of months say, oh, you know, did we get any feedback from Rachael? And I know we've had brief chats. I'm really pleased that you've come to join us with a wealth of information, and it seems that in trying to answer those questions, it almost seems that every time you peel back one layer, it opens up a whole load of others. So I'm really glad you've joined us to try and shed a little bit of light for us on all of this.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here doing it as well. So what I'm hoping we'll do today, Benedict, is I think you're going to share my slides. We'll talk about the slides, the data that's on the slides, and the way that we've represented it. I want to try and come back again over and over with the data as it changes over time. I haven't got a problem being transparent in principle. I think what's difficult about data and interesting, and part of the challenge is that you can slice it in many different ways, interpret it actually in many different ways, and things can go up and down, and they don't necessarily mean what you think they mean. So the conversation about the data is as important as the kind of raw figures or the pie charts or the bar charts. So the reason for having this conversation first is so that people can hear us talk about the data, hear us ask questions, including me asking questions. This is my data, but there are still things about it that puzzle me. I'm happy for their slide set to be shared afterwards. And I'm interested then in what people have found kind of easy to understand from both the conversation and the images, and what's more difficult to understand, because we can keep shifting how we represent the data and how we explain it and how we talk about it, but I need that bit of feedback to sort of help me know whether this is helpful to people or whether we need to kind of share the information in different ways. So you'll see quite a range of different images, different ways of representing data, different ways of thinking about the numbers, and hopefully all of that's helpful, but don't regard this as a kind of finished article. It's very much a work in progress.
Well, thank you. And I think it's what's been interesting in all of this is what I'm really pleased that our conversations from parents and this opportunity, I suppose, that Family Voice has to, I hope, make a better link between yourself and the system and parents' experiences, is that certainly in the work that we do with yourself and your officers, we are getting a sense that there's a greater ambition to be transparent than there was in the past, maybe, and when you start looking at data, it becomes almost difficult to find where is that transparency and how much information can we give people to be as transparent as possible. So I'm really looking forward to seeing and having that conversation about what you're sharing. I think we'll probably take questions from parents after today rather than as we go, because I'm not quick enough to do a juggling, and I think you've got so much information to share, but it's really welcome that you are welcoming that conversation and that dialogue to carry on.
I'm quite a wonk about data. I'm really interested in it and kind of curious about what it does show and what it can't show. So very happy to have that conversation very openly with you, Benedict. There are another couple of things in the presentation as well, which we may or may not get to. It depends on how detailed our conversation gets. But we will also ask some questions about panels. And so some of the slides kind of explain what all the different panels are and how they're set up and how often they operate. It is confusing, and we're doing some rationalization work around that in the background, but at the moment those are the panels that are currently in operation. So if we don't get to those slides, they will be in the papers that can be sent out. And also we've got some new team members. So in order to increase capacity in this area, really focus on our inclusion work, we now have got 4 assistant directors on a quadrant basis, sort of geographically in Surrey, but also with specific responsibilities for leadership in certain areas. And those are included in the slides too, so that people can understand a bit more about how we're increasing kind of capacity and effort and drive in this area, because we know it's an area for improvement. So
great, thank you so much. So shall I see if I can do the sharing of the screen?
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed indeed. Here it goes. And it is that one. And I'm going to press slideshow. How's that?
That is very impressive.
And I'm just seeing, and I think it's visible to our members, so that's fantastic. Rachel, over to you. And I think when we had a bit of a chat earlier in the week, we're going to kind of have a bit of a conversation. So if things come up, we will do like we did earlier in the week. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous.
Absolutely. Roll us on in that case to the first slide, and let's open the conversation up.
Here we go.
Yeah, so this is representing some data about requests to assess and decisions to issue, and this is to take you into the work about appeals and appeals that do or don't sometimes result in tribunals, and what that means. So one of the things that I know for parents, they feel really strongly when they're in this kind of bit of the system and a decision isn't made in accordance with what they would have wanted, is they feel like that the whole of the kind of all of the work that we do is ranged against them, and I understand that feeling. Actually, the amount of kind of contested work, even in this area, is relatively small. But what I understand is that for individual families, it's hugely important. And so what these are representing is where we haven't agreed with families, or indeed with schools. Sometimes it's the schools who make the initial application. So where we haven't agreed to a request to assess, or where we haven't gone on, where we maybe have agreed to an assessment, but we haven't gone on to issue a plan. And we've got 3 years worth of data, 2018, 19 and 2020, and these are calendar years. So one of the confusing things about working with children's data is that there tend to be at least 3 different years that we work to. One is the calendar year, so January to December. One is the financial year, which is April to the following March, and the other, of course, is the academic year, which runs September to August. And so sometimes you'll see what appears to be conflicting data, and it's simply because the slice of the year was a calendar year or an academic year or a financial year. But this data is from calendar years, and what it shows for the most recent year, for which we have full data, is 412 requests to assess, which was about a quarter of the overall requests to assess were not agreed, and then 105 requests to assess which were progressed led to a decision not to issue a plan, and that was 8%.
So one of the things I wonder, Rachel, if just to clarify, particularly for parents who aren't quite so adept to the system, is when you enter the EHCP process, often it's the school that you'll have a conversation with the school, they will start to gather evidence, they might have had your child on SEND support for a while, and that's not being enough. So they make a request to the local authority to do an official EHCP needs assessment. Mm-hmm. And there is a certain period of time to gather the information. I think it's 6 weeks off the top of my head. And then the local authority decides, yes, we will assess or we won't. And that's the first point at which a parent has the right to appeal a decision. Yeah. So what's really interesting for me about these figures is when we speak to parents, and we speak to a lot of parents in various different guises, the sense that we get is that the vast majority of requests are denied. And what's really interesting to me in this, in the data, is actually it's not, it's about a quarter. It really reminded me that when we are, as individuals, our numbers are always either 0 or 100%, aren't they? We either get the refusal or we don't. And it's also probably fair to say that the parents who are going to be seeking information and help and support are more likely to be those who haven't, whose process hasn't gone to plan. I hope that that's slightly reassuring. But I think
it's of no consolation. I think if you're a parent who's in that 105 where there has been a decision not to issue a plan, it's no consolation to you that there are more than 1,200 other parents who have had a plan issued.
Absolutely, I think that's really
absolutely understand that. I suppose it explains a little bit why we may feel more confident about our own processes than the parents necessarily do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because it's I think one of the really interesting things is that feeling in the air that you get from parents isn't reflected in that data, and it's good to have the data, I think, to be able to see and say, right, well, why? Then it leads you to the more important questions of, well, why was that refusal to assess happen? And more importantly, I suppose, how can I make sure that my child is supported in the way that they need to be?
And what you see on the right-hand side of the slide shows that an even smaller number of those end up in a tribunal. So there were 37 refusals to issue a plan in 2020 that ended up in tribunal. And 67 requests to assess in 2020 that ended up in tribunal. So there were more refusals for a request to assess, but they may then have gone on to be processed with additional information, etc., etc. So I think another thing that a lot of parents feel, and again, if you have gone all the way to a tribunal, you may get the sense that that's the only way to get the outcome that you want and you think is right for your child. But there are lots of initial phases of this process where the information isn't sufficient or it isn't clear enough for us to be able to progress it. But once that information is sufficient or is clear enough, then we can. So not everything that we refuse to assess at the beginning ends up in a tribunal.
So the other thing that I would say in that, Rachel, I'm not sure how the local authority can better understand this, but when you're, as a parent, when you're going through the system, the notion of going to tribunal is extremely daunting. And I think it's also fair to say that a very small proportion of those 412 parents, for example, who got a refuse towards assent, will either fully understand that they actually have the right to appeal and to go to tribunal, or will have the capacity to do it. And I think that's something it worries a lot of parents, that because so many parents who go to tribunal feel happy with the result and they can progress things, they worry about all of those parents who don't feel able to go there. And more importantly, the children who then, with a different parent, might have gone on to get additional support.
Yeah, I can understand that worry, and it's a few slides away, but when we get to it, I think there's a helpful slide which shows that shows how many decisions take place outside of tribunals. So and where we end up finding a workable way forward with families, which means they don't have to go to tribunal at all. So I think when we get there, I hope that that's a bit more encouraging, that we can start out in a place where we're disagreeing, and it can feel very difficult when we're not all on the same page, but that as we progress together, we find ways to meet a child's needs that are right. We secure an agreement. So anything else on this slide, or should we move on to the next one?
Move on. I'm aware that there's quite a lot to get through.
Quite a few to get through. Well, of course, if we don't get through them all, we can still send them out, and then people can submit their curious questions afterwards. But let's see how we go. So this is about overturned refusals over time, and you saw an earlier version of the slide set, Benedict, and we represented this differently before, and with bar charts, and it wasn't very helpful. I'm still not sure particularly whether pie charts are helpful, but let's see. So this data is taken from our own case management system. So the previous data was taken from something called the SCN2 return, which is public data that goes to government. And this is calendar year again, and it shows children rather than EHCP requests. So one of the conversations you and I had earlier in the week was, you know, if a request is made and then comes back later, is that 2 requests for the same, you know, for the same child, or is it just this one child? So this data is about children rather than requests, and what it's showing is when children have had 1 request refused in a year, or multiple refused or ongoing requests in the same year, or then a refused request which ends up actually in a plan. So you can see that there were 87 children in 2020 for whom this was true. And that's now 18% of that, our total proportion of children, where we refused initially, but ended up with a plan. And that's something that now we've started getting that data. I'm going to keep an eye on, because what you want to do is when you refuse requests, and sometimes refusing a request is the right thing to do, when you refuse a request, you want that to be correct. You don't want to refuse a request and then find out, you know, that you do end up issuing a plan because maybe you should have issued the plan sooner. So what I find helpful and encouraging is that the proportion of the total number of requests where we end up, if you like, you know, eating our words, is reducing over time. So it was 31%, then 24 in 2018, 24% in 2019. It's down to 18% in 2020. And hopefully, again, that is an improved picture. I haven't got the numbers for previous years, but that's because we had a smaller number overall of children in the system in those previous years.
And Rachel, do you know, of those 87 children who got the plan, do you know how many of those had to go to tribunal or into an appeal process? Well, appeal process presumably, yes, but how many of them actually had to go to tribunal to get that plan?
Actually, I don't know the answer to that question for those 87. And we'd probably need to dig back into individual records to establish that.
It would be interesting because, again, you know, so much of the experience of parents is we're still hearing the word fight comes up again and again and again. And I think all of us would like that language to change. But if that plan is the result of a tribunal process feels like a battle. It feels very adversarial. So it would be really, really interesting to know how those particular children got that plan.
Yeah, and we'd certainly want to continue to monitor this, because you know, again, sometimes it's absolutely right that that we end up in a tribunal. Sometimes there are really kind of very big differences between where we are and where parents are in relation to an issue. But essentially what we want is the same thing. We want children's needs to be met. And so we don't want to be in a tribunal so much. And Surrey does have more tribunals as a proportion of its casework than many other places. So you know, so it's a tiny proportion of our casework that ends up in tribunal, but proportionately there are other local authorities that don't end up in tribunal nearly so often, and that obviously is something that we need to pay attention to.
And I think one of the things that I hear a lot is the tribunal is a moment in time, isn't it, where you're all sat in front of the judge. For a family, that sense of being in tribunal almost starts with the decision to make the appeal, and feels like it lasts for a very, very long time. And so those decisions that are made before reaching the actual tribunal, in a personal experience, that can feel like one and the same thing. And that sense of, you know, if you get what you need, you have the sense that Surrey's conceded, and that feels, it just feels like a very strange, very adversarial process. And I think it's important, I suppose, in your data, where when you're talking about the tribunal, you're talking about it having gone all the way to that judge's decision, aren't you?
Well, yes, and as I say, I'm picking later on in the slides that some things that are appeals don't end up in a tribunal, and let's talk about that when we get to those slides. But yeah, you're you know, even if you don't end up in front of a judge, when you think you might end up in front of a judge, that is impactful as well. And one of the things I suppose I'm conscious of is when it's your child, you know, even if you might have several children in your family, it's still an absolutely huge part of your life and your, you know, work in inverted commas to prepare for that experience.
Yeah.
Within a local authority of any size, actually, because there's a lot of work for a lot of children going on all of the time, it is only a small proportion of that work. And in a local authority as big as Surrey, it's a small proportion of a very big amount of work, and it doesn't have the same impact on a caseworker, not because they don't care and they're not interested, but simply because a lot of their casework is also progressing at the same time for lots of other children, and that's going fine. And so, but if you're in a family and it's something's wrong for one of your children, that's not going fine at all, is it? So
you're right,
and we experience it differently on a human level.
I think the other thing is that for the caseworkers and tribunal officers and all of those, it's their job. They know what they're doing. They know the process. Yeah. Whereas parents are having a very, very steep learning curve. I spoke to a parent just this week who was saying the awful thing is that looking after my child in this process has become a full-time job. I can't work. But the worst part of it is that I'm so up to my eyes in having to deal with it and trying to talk to people that during the day, that by the time he comes home from school and he wants to play a game, I don't want anything to do with him because I've been dealing with him all day long. And I thought that was really, it was really telling. It was really important for those caseworkers who might get frustrated with us sometimes to really realize that for a parent, it's this, not only is it a job, but it's emotional because it's our children's future and we're having to learn how to do it. And it's playing catch up all the time. So it's no surprise really that we get our emotions and our reactions can be quite intense.
Yeah.
Shall I move on?
I think it helps us to understand as local authority employees, if we're parents ourselves, because if we stop and think for a moment about our own experience as a parent, being really strongly emotionally invested in what's going on for our children, then I think it helps us connect.
Absolutely. Shall I move us on?
Let's. So this is something that we can measure, which is the timeliness of education, health and care plans. I'm really aware, and we had this conversation the other day, Benedict, which is that the being on time isn't the half of it, is it? It's about the quality of the education, health and care plan, and we'll probably need a whole separate conversation another day to say more about quality. Because that's harder to convert into something you can represent on a screen, but there is lots of work going on to improve quality as well, and you may want to say a bit about that. I know you're involved in that, but this is just showing currently where we are with timeliness. So 60% of our EHCPs in January 2021 on time. I'm not satisfied with that. It needs to be higher, although it's actually fairly good compared with national averages, but that's 868 on-time education, health and care plans. And we'll move on to a slide in a minute that starts talking about how late the late ones are. But did you want to say anything about quality before we move on?
Yes, I think so. So I think the thing that I wanted to raise is the fact that there does seem to be some work happening at the local authority in terms of auditing plans and looking at their quality. We're using a tool that I think a number of local authorities are using. It's something that at Family Voice, I've been, as you know, I've volunteered for Family Voice for a while. I think I'm coming up to 9 or 10 years lurking around the forum. And I remember for years and years, these conversations where we were trying to say to the local authority, help me, why can't we as representative parents be involved in that quality assurance of what a plan is? And I'm really pleased to say that we were invited to that initial process. Was it last month, I think? It's really interesting because it does go from that legislation, that code of practice, and one of the basic questions which I know we all know about in the system but has yet to be addressed is so many plans on the social care bit say this child isn't known to the service, and that's kind of left, and we know that actually isn't sufficient. So I'm really pleased that that's being looked at. I know we hear from parents practically on a daily basis who have really serious issues with their plans because they're not, the provision isn't smart. It's so specified, measurable, achievable, and realistic and time bound, I think, is the thing. I know one of the things that's very difficult in the EHCP process is that time management, because we don't actually really want to amend and review, properly amend the plan until the next stage. But how do you know, child can change so much. So I don't have the answers as such at the minute, particularly as the forum. However, I think one of the big keys is not shying away from it and doing that audit and saying, okay, so we know that, for example, that social care side needs to be addressed somehow, and we know that these bits need to be looked at. And as the forum, we are really, really looking forward to that becoming a continued collaboration that we do. That was really what I wanted to say. And I think, as I say, the timeliness is really important, but it's not helpful when, as a parent, at that bit, when you get to plan a draft plan, you, as a parent, you have 15 days to make comments and send that back. And one of the most common pieces of feedback we get from parents is that they will spend a large amount of time and effort doing that. And the next thing they hear is they have a final plan that's taken no account of their comments. And that seems to be a problem of, oh, we've got to get this plan out on time. Whereas actually that dialogue at that point is so critical, particularly if you want to avoid the appeal process and tribunal stuff. So it felt important to qualify the timeliness thing, because so much of the time we get as parents, we hear, oh, but the timeliness is improving. And I'm thinking, stop, I want this right. That said, it is important that it doesn't go on for months and months and months.
Yeah. And so, and sometimes, because I see the correspondence, pass through my inbox sometimes, what people are saying is, issue it now so I can argue with it almost.
Yes.
I don't want to wait anymore. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to, develop systems that will support a much greater kind of clarity about where in the process things are and what we're waiting on. Because another thing is that sometimes what makes a plan delayed is something that is very much out of the hands of the caseworker. And then collective decisions sometimes might need to be made between the caseworker and the parent about whether we progress this now or whether we push harder with the other professionals involved to get more from them if that's possible. So that if we can achieve more of that through kind of better communication and dialogue, and I know that's a problem area and one that we're working on, so the more of that we can achieve, the better.
Absolutely. And I think we hear another thing, we hear a lot almost where the system goes into a kind of paralysis, where there is a decision has been made about the panel about the type of school, and none of the schools are responding saying they can meet that child's needs. And rather than actually, there seems to be an unwillingness on the panel's decision to go, okay, so that doesn't work, therefore maybe we need to look at something else. What's really heartbreaking, I think, for parents is that in those cases, they may have identified a school that can meet need. And as time goes by, as you go for weeks and sometimes months without any response from your caseworker, and your tribunal officer is trying to talk to the various people, there's this paralysis sets in. And of course, the place that you had identified gets filled by somebody else, sometimes from another county. And those can be really heartbreaking times, because as a parent, what you are seeing is there is no progress. It is that the whole system has just ground to a halt. And that's the kind of, that's one of the things that can be incredibly difficult to understand.
I get that, I see that.
Shall I move on? Or?
Yeah.
So I'll need a little Chris Whitty slide. Next slide, please.
Sorry, yeah, I should. This I won't dwell on this slide very much, but it is. I mean, in a sense, it speaks to your point that lateness may not be the biggest issue. Most of the plans that are late aren't very late. So you can see on the slide that the vast majority of plans now are on time, but of those that are late, a small proportion are just within the next week, then within 4 weeks of the expected end date. But some, and so there is the figures there on the right hand side, do go very much longer. And those that is a particular interest to me, because it strikes me that those are kind of, you know, special cause difficulties, if you see what I mean, for it's something to go very late in that way. So one of the things about data is that it's all very well talking about kind of performance and looking at headline numbers and things getting better or things getting worse. But what's really interesting, and what I'll never be able to share in detail here, is what is sitting in those individual situations. 203 plans, I think, there, which are more than 12 weeks over. And that, you know, that prompts a lot of questions for me, which will have probably 203 different answers.
And I think what the thing for me that I look at is I first looked at the percentages, and 7% feels like a small number, and then you look at 203 and 203 families, that immediately explains the amount of noise that we hear at Family Voice, because 200 families is a lot. And for those families, you know, many of those children won't be in school while that's happening. We know actually, that
even if it was one family, Benedict, for that one family, that would still be, you know.
I'm really glad you said that. I can't agree more. It's, you know, one of the things that I struggle with personally is one of our roles at Family Voice is to try and surface where the system is working well. Ideally where it's exceptional, but even just where things are okay, because if we can do that, we can say, right, well, if it can work at school A, then there's no excuse for school B or C not to be doing that. And let's learn from school A. But it's incredibly difficult to share good stories when the stories that we hear are so tremendously heartbreaking at times, and they're not. You know, it's one thing where you've got a child who is waiting for their EHCP and they're still in school, and the school is going to kind of hobble through with the amount of support and waiting, and it's far from ideal, but at least there is a sense of normality. But when we hear of families whose children can't access any school, parents have sometimes had to stop work, there's then the ensuing difficulties of life. And one of the things that those families tell us so often is that they are trying to get some alternative provision that should be in place, and that is another battle that comes in. It's noisy enough that it needs to be surfaced, because those things, as you say, shouldn't be happening to one family, let alone up to 200.
Yeah, and to touch on what I was saying before, it's of no consolation to a family to hear all the good news stories. I mean, there are thousands of good news stories in this system, but that, firstly, that's of no consolation, and secondly, it doesn't fix the issue that's going on for that family and that child. So all the good news stories in the world, and I do have to keep surfacing the good news stories, and I have to reflect them back to my staff, because one of the best ways of improving a service is looking at what's working where it's working, so that you can replicate that elsewhere. So I am doing that a lot of the time. I'm surfacing the good news stories, but that doesn't fix, you know, one person's good news over there doesn't fix the issue over there.
Can I ask, because when I do ask our members for the good stories, I get, and I've been in a lot of these situations, so these answers absolutely, they really hit a chord in me, but if you want to hear the good stories, that's just going to hide the bad ones. It means you don't want to hear the bad ones. What if parents say that to you? What's your answer to that?
Well, I mean, I couldn't hide the bad news stories if I wanted to, because they arrive in my inbox. They come across my desk a lot of the time, as you know, and we talked about this last time. I don't necessarily respond personally because I'm not involved in the detail of the casework, but I do see the majority of the incoming, email traffic, and so I follow what some of the issues are. So I'm not unaware, and the teams aren't unaware.
We have the other thing, I suppose, which a lot of what's interesting for me about this conversation is it's really important to get that data, but it's an opportunity also to raise questions that I hear so often. And one of the things that families get told, and at Family Voice we sometimes get this response, is raise an issue and the professional involved will say, well, it's just a one-off. And that's very, very hard to hear, because we know it's not a one-off. And I wonder whether culturally that's something that you come across with your officers and people in the system, and whether it's something that you feel able to counter.
I'm just trying to think about whether it's, I don't think I've ever heard it's just a one-off in the context of something that I've seen more than once. So very occasionally I see combinations of extraordinary circumstances which to my mind, even in a place as big as Surrey, are genuinely one-offs.
Yes.
But they're no less important. It's not a problem that doesn't need solving just because it's only happened once. I see things that people would describe as unusual, and they are unusual, but again, those are still problems that need solving. I suppose the distinction for a big complex system is when you look at something which is part of a pattern and which needs a big change in the way that we organize ourselves, yes, or allocate work, or treat the work that comes in, then those take one kind of response. Yeah. From a kind of strategic leadership point of view. We might need to increase funding for a significant number of new caseworkers, or we might need to buy a new system and make a business case for that. So there are patterns of things that require a kind of system response. There are other things which are, I suppose, a collection sometimes of individual failings that are really hard to manage out of the system altogether. So sometimes you'll find situations where a person is off sick and their line manager is away, and someone else, for whatever reason, is tied up somewhere else, and an important communication didn't take place. Now that happens in a lot of different places in the system, because it's a very big organization with lots of individuals working in it, and some of these things are more predictable than others. None of that's okay, but it's very difficult to organize that out of a system, although there are things that we're trying to do to make it less likely that those kind of gaps line up altogether and leave a parent without a point of contact. So yeah, I suppose I'm rambling a bit, but I'm just going back to that kind of, I think that's a failure of empathy in the moment, actually, on the part of caseworkers when they say that. And I'm sorry if that's what's said to parents, because one of the things that I've just said it, even if it is a very unique set of circumstances, which is genuinely a one-off, it doesn't make it better for that parent in that moment, does it?
Absolutely. And I suppose for me, if it was actually a one-off, then there's no excuse for not dealing with it and fixing it really very quickly. It's good to hear. And the things that we've heard in the past and sometimes kind of pop up still again are things like, these plans that take forever to sort out, or there's miscommunication or lack of communication from a caseworker, and a parent will raise it as a complaint, and the response that they get, this never happens. And thinking, well, no, it happens all the time. So I think it's reassuring, I suppose, to hear from you that there will be those strategic things that need to be addressed. And if we could make sure that the culture changes enough that, as you say, the empathy, be it from the caseworker or indeed that complaints team, which is a whole other discussion, I suspect, needs to remember that at the heart of it is a child in need, with a parent doing their absolute best to advocate for that child, and coming across a system that's not working in the way they were told it would work. So
I accept that.
Lovely.
Move us on.
Yep.
Let's talk about tribunal appeals. So this is showing the cumulative number of appeals by year. And when we talked about this graph a bit earlier in the week, Benedict, I remember you going, oh, now I understand.
Do you know,
a set of
you're
numbers
right.
that had been shared with you. So to be clear, we don't have 426 new appeals in October after 400 in September and 338 in August. That's the cumulative total. So we've had 26 additional appeals in October since September. That's a cumulative graph.
And so you've got 426 since the beginning of the year. And that, as you say, I remember seeing a Facebook conversation where I was desperately trying to search for the information, where, you know, somebody had shared that there'd been 272 appeals in July, and then there were however many in October. And then we met, and you mentioned a total number for last year, I think. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. What am I missing? And when I saw this slide, it was, oh, but it is so tremendously difficult to get clarity and information on this as a parent. And it's such an emotive issue that it's good to see this. And I'd say, I think, if we could convince local authorities across the land, bless them, to be more transparent. What I found really interesting in the conversation that we had earlier in the week, and that's led to these slides, is when you actually look at finding the data, it seems that actually the systems don't necessarily collate it in a very cohesive way. One of the things that I'm really pleased is that by having this conversation, I feel like I've given you some extra work, which I'm slightly sorry about, but actually mostly I'm thinking this is it. It's really interesting to make the system peel back the layers and say, actually, how did this come from? And let's see how it progresses. The other thing, when I saw this particular one that I was interested in, was if we look at this, we've obviously got, 100 more appeals by this October than you had last year. What we don't know from this chart is what percentage of the total number of plans that is. And I was interested to know, well, as a proportion, are you seeing an increased number of appeals or not? Because depending on that proportion, it may be that appeals are coming down. And I thought that was an interesting question.
So we'll probably have to do a bit more work to represent that data. The proportion of appealable events that get appealed is fairly constant, but there are a number of different appealable events, including, the refusal of a request to assess, and then a decision not to issue a plan. So it may fluctuate a bit, because the appeals will represent an appeal at any appealable stage in the process, and that's going to be harder to dig in to show what a proportion of plans it is. We've got about 11,000 children on a plan, and of course some appeals may relate to a child who isn't on a plan but is part of the SEN support cohort and maybe is seeking a plan. Yes. So it's not always clear what that number should be a proportion of, if that makes sense. I mean, one thing it does show is that the absolute number is going up, and we would, I think, prefer that not to be the case if we can find a way to avoid it. So absolutely. And let's move on to the next slide, because you talked about local authorities all across the land. So we get asked sometimes, because we talk sometimes about whether we're outliers or we're behaving similarly to other local authorities. We have quite a lot of informal information because local authorities talk to each other and share, but and there's some publicly available data which does compare and contrast local authorities, but what we don't do is kind of tell tales, I suppose. So you can see 3 other local authorities on this chart, which are statistical neighbours of Surrey. And a statistical neighbour is an organisation which shares lots of similar characteristics. And the reason for using statistical neighbours rather than just all the other local authorities in the southeast or something like that is because some authorities will have very different characteristics, and therefore you'd expect them to behave differently or appear to be different. But this SE1, SE2 and SE3 are their counties, they are broadly in the south, and therefore they have other similar sort of demographic factors that make them quite like Surrey. And so when we do comparability tests, we kind of look at the other local authorities on that basis. And what that shows is that we do have a higher rate. So the trend line, that blue dotted line, kind of shows that your number of tribunals kind of hugs quite closely to a proportion of your appealable decisions, and that's not a surprise. The more appealable decisions you've got, the more appeals you're likely to have. You can see at the far end on the right hand side an outlier. I know which local authority that is, but I'll keep that to myself. But we are a bit of an outlier, as you can see, around the 10,000 appealable decisions mark. We would want to be closer to that blue dotted line, because that would be more in proportion.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We, as parent-carer forums, we try and look also at how other forums work in the country, and parent-carer forums are a strange little group because there isn't actually a clear guideline on how they should be organised and what they should be doing specifically. So each one has evolved in quite a different way. We're currently working quite closely with West Sussex because we have similar setups, and as you say, we were looking also for a local authority that is broadly comparable. We hear a lot of amazing work from Portsmouth, and I know that there are kind of initiatives that we look at Portsmouth for, but comparing Portsmouth as a local authority to Surrey obviously wouldn't make any sense because they are tiny and they're all in an urban setting, whereas transporting children in Portsmouth, I suspect, is quite a lot easier than in Surrey. So that's really interesting. So can I just ask, because I looked at this and I immediately went southeast for the SE. Is that the case, or is the E something?
Actually, well, they're two of those authorities are southeast authorities, and one is an East of England authority. They're counties, so they share similar demographics to us.
Just because my brain goes to these funny little things, does SE stand for anything?
It does stand for southeast, and it should, but I happen to know that they're not three southeast authorities. So I think there's been brilliant work done on these slides by a colleague in my team, Ben, who I ought to thank publicly actually for the huge amount of work he's done, including many iterations of these slides when I went back with more questions. And I think I gave an instruction late yesterday, because when you saw some slides earlier in the week that named local authorities in them and I asked to have them taken out, and I didn't make clear whether I wanted the particular region, and so they've all been labelled as southeast. One of those is actually an Eastern Region authority, as I happen to know. But
lovely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So we'll correct that at the next time of asking.
Yeah.
I'm going to flip us fairly quickly through the next two slides, Benedict, but this shows you both the kind of real difference between different kinds of local authorities. So as you can see on that slide, Surrey is ranked 15th. This is out of 150 upper tier authorities in the proportion of tribunals per appealable decision. So we have 2.91% of our appealable decisions are actually head for a tribunal.
Right. In one case, the local authority is reporting an 8.33%, which is 2 out of 20. I don't know why that isn't 10% actually, but there you go. Indeed.
And you can tell that's a completely different scale and type of local authority from our own. So, take that with a pinch of salt. Pop to the next slide, which shows you more in relation to our kind of national and southeast comparators, and again those local authorities that we looked at before. Now you can see that we are out of the pack at 2.91% of those 10,340 appealable decisions, and that is essentially that's a numerical representation of that kind of scatter graph that you saw earlier on, and that's us deviating from that blue dotted line. So over time, and if we have these conversations again in the months and years to come, over time, I'd like to see us get much closer to that blue.
Yeah. We talk a lot, don't we, about this business of Surrey being outliers, particularly in EHCP numbers. And we were talking earlier in the week. I was saying, well, the percentage difference isn't very much. So why does Surrey make such a big deal of this? And then your answer was, well, a percentage is one thing, but actually it equates to this number. And that's where it causes a problem. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's why I'm trying to represent as far as I can percentages and numbers, so that you can see what a difference it makes. You know, when you have a small percentage of a very big number, that's a very big number.
Yeah.
And conversely, a big percentage of a very small number stays a very small number as well. So that's worth understanding. I'm conscious of the time moving on, and I don't want to kind of rush us, but I know. Oh
gosh, yes, it's already 10:50. Good grief.
This was the slide that I referred to earlier, which I hoped might be a bit encouraging. Which is where something that is appealed doesn't end up in a tribunal. So between September 2020 and July of this year, we had 378 appeals. 94 of those are ongoing, so we can't account for them here. But of those, only 105 were heard. And I'll come back in the next slide to what that means. But 179 of them, so those that have been resolved so far, 63%, didn't go on to be heard. So a decision was made without needing the involvement of a judge. The family weren't required to attend a hearing. And so that's a kind of an important thing to understand.
And in those, sorry, can I just, in those, what I found really interesting in the conversation we were having previously is, because those are everybody agrees with that final decision. Am I right in thinking that we have situations where the parents will go away thinking, thank goodness, you know, I've won this. But similarly, the local authority will go home and go, oh, phew, I've won this.
We try really hard to avoid that language.
Yes.
I really understand the temptation. I mean, I saw that special needs jungle item because you sent me the link, which says, you know, nobody wins a tribunal. You know, I think that's the spirit in which we should approach these things. We should try not to be in a tribunal, or even on our way to a tribunal, if we possibly can. But there's much more grey space than there is absolutely unequivocal victories or defeats. And if you move us on to the next slide, actually that shows a little bit. So we've not used the language of winners or losers on this slide either, but that segment, which was unheard outcomes, contains decisions that you know weren't opposed by the local authority. So somehow we've got into a place where a family is appealing, but we've arrived at a place where we're all in agreement about what it is that the family wants. I mean, we ought to look at that, because we ought not to find ourselves in that space, you know. But I think sometimes if families are told that they're going to need to appeal to get the thing they want, they might sometimes head down that path prematurely, when, you know, more talking and listening on all parts was needed. But 70 not opposed at all by the local authority, 73 by consent order, and that is actually where we reach an agreement with the family, but for whatever reason it seems best to get that enshrined by the tribunal. So there's no hearing, there's no judge's decision, but that is cemented in an order. And then in some cases families withdraw, and I don't know the reason behind the withdrawal, but you know, it wouldn't be surprising to me if 27 cases was the number of families that moved somewhere else, you know.
Right.
While in a process, just because life's like that. If you think of just the number of families in Surrey, you know, so there may be all sorts of reasons, and I don't know, we'd have to dig into that to find it. But the heard outcomes, so only 7 of the heard outcomes were found kind of unequivocally in favour of the local authority, and 4 of them were found in favour of families, 54 in total of those heard outcomes. But then partially upheld is another 10, and 27 resolved through consent. And again, when I look at the resolved through consent, and obviously those that are upheld by the judge in relation to families, we'd want to try and achieve those as either unheard outcomes, or you know, before we get to the appeal stage at all.
Rachel, is there any work happening? So what I see as a parent in that is that at the end of this, there are a majority of children who end up with support that initially the local authority didn't think they needed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Maybe.
So I suppose what I'm wondering is there work to understand why did that case need to go this far? And it seems that some of that is about getting the information. And there seems to be a real delay in gathering that information or understanding and analysing the whole thing in order to say, right, well, maybe this child needs only a small amount of physiotherapy, for example, that wouldn't necessitate a plan. But if you look at that, plus this, that, and the other, actually, this is a complex picture. And yes, and a lot of families come to us and say, well, why aren't they taking, we've provided this information ages ago. And they said, no. So we've gone to appeal and finally they've agreed with us. But we feel like our child has lost 6 months, and 6 months of therapy, of additional provision, makes a huge difference in a child's life, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I think that's true, and I think that the additional resource that we have brought into the service will help us to tackle some of that, including, actually, I didn't mention it when we were talking about Portsmouth a couple of slides ago, but we've snagged an assistant director from Portsmouth, so we're on the lookout, for ways that we can improve the service, kind of in lots of different domains. I mean, the first thing, I suppose, to be clear about is the huge number of children whose additional needs are being met through SEN support, which is a very significant number, and that the vast majority of what comes forward as a request for an EHCP comes nowhere near this space at all. So children's needs are met, local authorities working with families, securing the right provision, and those children's needs are met with through an EHCP that hasn't been contested at all anywhere, at all en route.
And that feels,
I was saying earlier, that doesn't help the families where it's not so, but it does suggest that what we don't want to do is just kind of throw everything up in the air and start again. There's a lot of solid work that we should be building on and developing, rather than kind of dismantling.
It's true that I always think of the family that's entering the system and that might pop into our Facebook group, and I saw a number of conversations recently where really the sense from families was a tribunal is part of the EHCP process. That really worries me from the perspective of that new parent, because it certainly shouldn't be the case. But it's really hard without knowing that data. Actually, is it? And it sounds as though your data is showing that it isn't. The majority of them don't go in anywhere near that appealable thing, which is reassuring. And I think it's really good if we can keep having these discussions and having that transparency of the data, such that we can maybe reassure families at the beginning, but mostly be ready as a system to step in and support them if they get to that point, and be as realistic as possible. Should I click on to the next one?
Yes. So this is where we get into a bit more sort of other local authority data. And so one of the questions that we get asked a lot is Surrey really as much of an outlier as it claims to be? And this was where we got into the conversation, didn't we, about percentages versus numbers. We've just shown percentages on this screen because otherwise it's very difficult to kind of see the information at all. But the tower that you can see on the right hand side of the Surrey column, which is the third column in from the left, is the tallest tower there. So in comparison with England, where 3.7% of the child population has an education, health and care plan, we are 4.2% in the same year. So we're bigger than England, bigger than the South East, which is at 3.9. So you can see South East is slightly higher than England, and then comparable local authorities in the South East and the East, 3.9, 3.7, 2.7%. And so all local authority areas, those numbers are climbing, but Surrey's have started from a higher base and have climbed higher faster than elsewhere. And what's interesting is that our SEN support population, so if you like, the kind of the pool of children in Surrey with additional needs, from whom that smaller group, the EHCP population, are subsequently drawn, is much closer in Surrey to the national. So we're just 0.3 percentage points away from the England average there at 12.5 rather than 12.2.
And I remember,
and actually we've got SE2, another local authority, has a much larger SEN support population, which is interesting to me, because that suggests that those children's needs are being met through the support that's ordinarily available in their schools and settings, and that that's an area of interest, I think.
And we had a really interesting conversation about looking at the why of all of this, and I think what parents often hear from Surrey is, we need to reduce the number of EHCPs. What I found much more helpful when we spoke was, we need to understand why that's higher, and see, are there valid reasons? Is it because there's not enough SEN support? Is it because there's not, is it because we have a magic, strange population? And I think those questions have yet to be properly answered. Is that right?
Well, because they're very, very difficult to answer at a population level. So why one child does or doesn't have an EHCP, sometimes with very similar background and additional needs, some of it may depend. I mean, one of the things that we're really keen to do is to support all of our mainstream settings to be as inclusive as the most inclusive settings, which means the best offer possible at SEN support. And of course, if you do have your needs met well where you are, then you don't need to move to a new school, move to a new setting, have lots of additional other measures and interventions. So there is something about whether we've got what we need in terms of kind of that really broad offer before you go anywhere near an education, health and care plan, and all of that's part of the strategy. Benedict, I'm now on borrowed time, but there are, it is worth kind of moving, if we can, through some other slides too.
Absolutely. So this, shall I let you manage the time that you've got? I know we are on borrowed time, and we will be making these slides available to everybody.
I'll whiz through just a few more slides, just really so that people have heard me talk about them before they go into circulation. So this kind of shows where those additional numbers come from. So this is where we are, an outlier, in the detail of those columns. A lot of that is in our under 5 population. So you can see that per 10,000 children, we have 71 per 10,000 children in the age group of 0 to 4, which with an EHCP, which is significantly different from national and from the southeast. And then in 5 to 10 years old, similarly, there's quite a big gap. We're a long way from the pack. We get closer at 11 to 15, pretty much aligned by 16 to 19, and actually we find ourselves lower between 20 and 25, and we've got some really good kind of pathways into employment preparing for adulthood stage, which may be the explanation for that. I haven't been able to go into detail to know the reason why, but I just thought it was helpful to show that. And again, you and I, we saw similar data presented slightly differently earlier in the week, but saying, is it good news or bad news that we have so many EHCPs in 0 to 4 years? And if the answer to that question is that at 20 to 25 we can have fewer young people still needing an EHCP, but actually they're ready to engage without that additional support with the next phase of their life, wouldn't that be a brilliant outcome? So I don't assume necessarily that a high rate is a negative thing, but if what we're doing is we're funneling children from a very young age into a kind of an excluded cohort of young people, then I think that would be a bad outcome for those children. So,
it is really interesting, and I think I'm really interested at the older group, because we've recently had a significant number of parents come to us with young people aged 18 plus who haven't had as much support as they needed up until then, and actually need an EHCP to continue, because as we know, we've got a population of children who take a little bit longer often, and at the moment the experience of those parents is that it feels impossible, not just accessing it, there seems to be very little in the system that's geared up for a young person to enter the system at that age. And when I look at that, my parent experience head goes, oh, well, that's, you know, you've got fewer of them because the system isn't geared up to take them. If it is, you know, if potentially we've actually supported those young people and they drop off, that's wonderful. But as you say, it gets back to the more questions.
Yeah, it's speculative, isn't it, at this stage? So the next two slides, and let's just you know, these are about complaints. Let's move on to the next one. This is about the proportion of young people with additional needs without a place of transition. I know that that's a big deal, but we've worked really hard, created lots of additional places in Surrey, and that's lower this year than last year. We haven't been tracking that over preceding years. We will track that going forward because it's such an important part of our development. Move us on to the next one, because the other thing that we talk about quite a lot and people ask questions about is around placement costs.
Yeah.
So I think this slide is really, really clear about where our gaps are and where our costs lie. So we are extreme outliers, if you can tell, in relation to how much we spend on non-maintained independent provision as a percentage of the total per head expenditure. So we're spending significantly more in the independent sector than our 5 closest statistical neighbours, than our 10, or than the South East region. And that's a standout issue for us. Our top up in mainstream, so that is what supports our mainstream schools to support young people with additional needs well, we're spending less than our statistical neighbours, less than the 5 or the 10, and less than the South East region. We've spent more proportionately in 1920 than we did in 16-17, a little bit of fluctuation there, but it's noticeably less.
And that actually makes a lot of the conversation I hear from schools make a lot more sense.
Yeah. And then also, if you think about, there's a group of young people for whom mainstream absolutely isn't right, but non-maintained independent setting wouldn't be our first port of call. We're not spending enough in place funding for special schools and alternative provision. So you can see again, so this is about our provision in Surrey in the maintained sector, and that's where a huge amount of capital investment is going in, 290 additional places at the start of this school year, and we'll continue to. We've got 4 phases of capital investment and bringing additional places on stream. And so this slide, I'm sure that we'll return to again.
Sorry, yes, I clicked to
share progress. This is just a little bit about caseloads and cases and average workload. So we're divided into 4 quadrants, geographical quadrants. You can see the staffing that is available. You can see the amount of casework that is held in those areas. We try and keep caseloads to a kind of similar level in the different areas. You can see that we've got the South East probably under the most pressure there with the highest caseloads, but actually anywhere between 166 and 179. That's not the last local authority I was working in. Caseloads for caseworkers were over 200.
Oh wow!
At the time that I started there, we did bring them down to about 150, but it's not an unusual caseload.
That's actually really helpful to know, because I was looking at that saying, oh, well, now I understand why so many of the parents who come to me with problems with communication are from the South East. It seems as a very innocent and ignorant parent, that seems like a ridiculously large caseload, but presumably some of them will be very straightforward and not take a lot of time. But yeah, it's very interesting.
So just very last few slides then. These next 2 slides are the new assistant directors who I was referring to. So Tracy Sanders and Jim Nuns in the Southwest and the Northwest. And then on the next slide, Sandra Morrison, who many people will already know because she's been with us a long time, but she's now formally our AD for inclusion in the South East. And Julia Catherine, who joins us from Portsmouth and who I met earlier this week. She's our latest arrival covering the North East. And you can see that they've got, as well as quadrant responsibility, they've got some specific lead responsibilities for areas of the kind of programme of development work in SEND. So this...
it's really good to see that. I think it's going to help a lot of a lot of people know, who has that responsibility and accountability for those areas. Thank you very much for that.
That's okay. And then the last two slides, which I won't spend time on, but they're there to kind of help people understand this work, is the panel. So there's a joint commissioning panel. Some parents will remember it under its previous name, which was a high needs panel. We have an education governance panel, a post-16 panel. People are probably tearing their hair out just listening to me talking about this.
I think people are probably going, oh, yeah, because we often as parents, it just goes to panel. We don't, we rarely get told which or what, or if there are more than that. It's this mystical, magical thing, isn't it? So this is really helpful.
We will try and put that right. So I can certainly take back a message that says, can you be clearer with parents which panel it's going to, and why? But also what I will say is that there's work ongoing to review these, to improve the governance, to streamline. So when you read the detail of these slides, you'll see that they genuinely do address different issues, different kind of situations. And we have an escalation panel every week, which is supposed to deal with those issues that can't be resolved anywhere else. So that paralysis that you referred to earlier should be addressed. Those are three. So Hayley, Tina, and Liz are three directors who are my direct reports. So they, if you like, they kind of take that right to the most senior level to kind of try and unpick the difficulties. But it still feels like a kind of confusing scenario for most parents to try and get to grips with. So we'll see if we can make that better.
Rachel, I'm aware that you've got a meeting in 4 minutes, and I must let you go. I've just had a quick question from a parent, which I thought was worth mentioning it because it might mean that we think about the next session a bit differently. They've asked, once everybody's had a chance to absorb the slides, could the next session with you be a Q&A with questions from parents? And I wonder how we would do that, but there's got to be a way of doing it.
I don't have a problem with doing a Q&A. One of the challenges, though, is that I'm not necessarily the best person to answer all of the questions that parents might have. So what you don't do as the exec director is have everybody else's brain in your brain and everybody else's understanding of the detail of their work in your head. So I'm willing to give it a try. But I may struggle. I mean, you might actually find that a panel event is better than just questioning me. I'm not opposed to answering questions, but I think it's something that we should kind of take on and have a think about how we can arrange that. And I would absolutely, I think we've come to the end. Yes. We have. Stop sharing now. I would really encourage parents to send us questions at contact@familyvoicesurrey.org, and we will collate everything. We're also going to make sure that your slides are available to parents. Thank you so much for the time you've given us again, and I think the work that's gone into peeling those layers, because my understanding is that initial question that was come up about the statistics actually led to a lot more complicated digging. Well, I went away from the last conversation thinking, how can we all be in the same system, having the same things happening to us, but experience it and understand it and count it in such very different ways? And so that has been an exploration worth having, and they'll continue, I think, to be different ways in which we count things, partly because we do experience them differently. That whole thing about if it's your child, how it feels when it's your child in the middle of this system, necessarily means that we experience things very differently, I think, than caseworkers do, even when caseworkers are really, very connected, very family focused, very child centered, and doing all the right things. Even then, I think it's not the same as being a child's mum or dad or other carer. So.
Absolutely. I think that's it. That feels like a lovely place to end. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, sometime in the new year.
The new year sounds really good.